Loyalty still means something in this country, but some people seem to have forgotten that. People who believe land only has value when it's filling their pockets with concrete and profit. People who haven't lived what we lived, who never felt the scent of wet soil mixed with sweat and sacrifice. And it was exactly those people who came knocking at the gate of Bill Anderson, a 72-year-old farmer who, for over 5 decades, built his life on the same land where he saw his daughter take her first steps and where he swore she would rest in peace. But some promises, the world just doesn't let you keep that easily. They wanted to take his land. They came with papers, with offers, with threats. But they forgot one thing. Bill wasn't just anyone. He was the kind of man who survived both outer and inner wars. A man who learned in the hardest way possible that the real battle isn't fought on the battlefield, but in the mind. And that's why, when everything seemed lost, something awakened inside him. Something even his enemies didn't see coming. An echo from the past. A buried secret. A name whispered in the dark. She's alive. This isn't just a story about a piece of land under dispute. It's about memory, loyalty, and sacrifice. About promises made in trenches and debts that stretch across generations. And above all, it's a story about resistance. Because there are things that can't be bought, forced, or erased. Things that root deep, that bleed, that rise. And when the last shovelful of dirt seems to have sealed the end, the truth finds a way to grow. You know, I always thought old age would bring peace. A little rest after so many years working hard, tending the land, enduring rain and sun without complaint. I was wrong. My name is Bill Anderson. 72 years on my back, callous hands, and a piece of land that once belonged to my father, my grandfather, and before him, to an Anderson who came here when all this was just forest and hope. But it seems like nobody respects that anymore. A piece of paper with a lawyer's stamp is worth more than a lifetime of sweat. They came with machines, with offers, with fake smiles. Said it would be better for me. Better how? By taking me away from the only place I've ever called home? So I started writing. By hand, actually, in a leather-bound notebook that I kept hidden behind the fireplace. A diary? Maybe, but really it was more of a log. I needed to document everything, in case something happened. Old war habit. Names, times, sounds, even the behavior of birds. I wrote it all down. And that's how I noticed the pattern. Every time that black car with tinted windows drove down the road, the wind changed direction. I know it sounds crazy, but it was always the same. And the silence, a heavy silence, would hang in the air for a few seconds. Like time itself was holding its breath. I didn't tell anyone. I learned the hard way that some battles are won in silence. But even so, something in me wanted to scream. And that scream would come, I knew it, not through words, through actions. Only that night, before I could do anything, another envelope appeared under the door. This time, no stamp, no name, no sender. And inside, an old photograph. Me and my squad at a base in Afghanistan. On the back, in a familiar handwriting, the debt is still alive. At that moment, I knew I wasn't alone anymore. It took me a few minutes to process what was happening. That photo, I hadn't seen that face in over 40 years. Sergeant Miller, a tough man but fair. They used to say he could smell traps on the wind. He was the one who taught me that silence, sometimes, is worth more than 1,000 bullets. And now, there was that memory sent by someone who knew too much. The sentence on the back wasn't just a warning. It was a summons. And if it really was him, or someone from our past, then everything was about to change. Fast. That same night, I pulled the old iron trunk from the back of the basement. It was heavy, rusted, but still locked with the same number combination I never forgot. Inside, the past stared back at me. My old military jacket, some documents, and the cold M1911 I kept like it was part of my body. I never thought I'd need to dig this stuff up again. But something inside told me this war would be different. It wasn't about borders or ideologies anymore. It was something more personal, more intimate, a fight to keep a story alive, my story. And no one was going to steal that from me. I stayed awake the whole night. Every creak from the porch made me get up. The cattle, usually calm at night, were restless for no reason. The dogs barked at nothing, and I knew none of it was coincidence. I grabbed a notebook and kept writing everything down. At 3:17 a.m., I heard footsteps in the cornfield, slow dragging. I went out to the porch with my gun on my waist and a flashlight in hand. The light was shaking, but I wasn't. The beam swept across the crops until it hit something odd. A hat. The same model I wore back in the 80s, but old, torn, and stained with dried blood. Only, I hadn't lost any hat. It was a message, one I understood perfectly. The next day, I went into the village. The looks were different. People avoided eye contact. It was like they knew something but were too afraid to say. Only one pair of eyes held courage. Old Mrs. Clara, who had served me coffee since the 90s. She gripped my hand tightly and said, "They're messing with forces they don't understand, Bill. This isn't just about land. It's about control." I asked what she meant, but she just shook her head and pointed to the sky. "The storm is coming, my son, and it's not coming alone." I went home with a weight on my chest. This wasn't a fight over property anymore. It was something bigger, something darker. That afternoon, I was surprised by a pickup truck parked at my gate. Inside, a man with his face hidden under a cap and dark sunglasses. He didn't get out of the car, just rolled down the window and said, "You have until Friday to accept the offer. After that, there are no more options." And then he left. No name, no number. I went back inside and wrote in my notebook. They underestimate a man who has nothing left to lose. And that's when the decision was made. I was going to fight back, but not the usual way. Not with lawyers or petitions. I was going to use what I'd learned, and, if necessary, what I had buried. The following days, I reinforced the fences, installed cameras, checked every corner of the property. At night, I slept with one eye open and the Colt loaded by my side. And it was during one of those early mornings that I saw it. A figure, standing at the far end of the field. It was distant, but clearly watching me. When I pointed the flashlight, it didn't move. Only after a few seconds did it slowly walk back into the woods. But it made no sound. None. No branches snapping, no leaves crunching. And in the silence that followed, I heard something, a whistle, thin, precise, like someone who had once stood beside me. I returned to the house in full alert. There was something about that presence that wasn't human, and yet not entirely unfamiliar. As if part of it was made of my own memories. I began reviewing the notes. The patterns were becoming clearer. The shadows always showed up on nights with a waning moon. The whistle, always at 4:04. And the black car, always driving at the same speed, exactly at 6:43. It was as if everything was orchestrated, as if they wanted to drive me insane. But they made one mistake. I've been there before, and I came back whole. The next morning, when I opened the door, I found a wooden box on the porch. No sender. Inside, just a tape recorder. I pressed play. A hoarse, scratchy voice whispered, "You can't protect her forever." But there was no one with me. No woman, no child. Or was there? For a moment, my throat tightened. I thought of Annie. She'd be almost 50 now if she'd survived. But I hadn't spoken of her to anyone in decades. How could someone know? That was the message. They were stirring up ghosts I didn't even want to revisit. I grabbed the recorder, threw it into the fireplace, and watched it melt like butter. This wasn't just pressure. It was psychological warfare. And I knew how to play that game. Still, that night, I went to bed with the feeling that something was inside the house. And maybe something was... The frames were tilted. The wall clock had stopped exactly at 4:04. The radio turned on by itself and tuned to a station that doesn't exist anymore. It wasn't just paranoia. They were messing with things they didn't know how to control. And that was dangerous. For them, that morning, the sky was darker than usual. Not a rain cloud. Something else. A strange heaviness in the air, as if even the light was afraid to show up. The rooster didn't crow. The birds were gone. And the silence, that damned silence. Have you ever felt the world so quiet it seemed to be watching you? That was it. I sat on the porch, coal on the table. coffee getting cold. When I went to take the first sip, I noticed something. Someone had moved the mug. It was subtle, but the handle was turned the wrong way. And I never get that wrong. Someone had been inside, and the worst part, they left no trace. I stood up slowly, trying to keep my hand steady. I walked around the house, but found no signs of forced entry. The windows were locked. The back door left just as I had placed it. Nothing out of place, except one detail. My mother's Bible, which always sat on the nightstand, was now open on the page of Psalm 91. That verse had followed me for years, but I hadn't opened it, and there was a new bookmark, a piece of red cloth that smelled of lavender. It froze me inside. Lavender was my wife's perfume, but she died 20 years ago, and no one else knew that. At least, that's what I thought. I went back to the journal, wrote down every detail, every feeling, trying to organize my thoughts. But something was clear now. They had access, and not just physical. They were stirring the past, digging into deep, intimate memories. I began to notice deeper patterns. The threats weren't direct. They came loaded with symbols. Things from my past, from my life before the farm. It was as if someone was reading my story, page by page, and twisting the plot like a sadistic author. But what they didn't know is that I learned to write my own ending. That same afternoon, I received a visit that changed everything. A truck from the city hall showed up, saying they were there to verify the property boundaries. 3 men, all young, clean uniforms. But the eyes told another story. That wasn't protocol. One of them took too many pictures. Another stared directly at my house, like he was looking for something. The third stayed silent the whole time, just watching. When they left, they forgot an old, worn measuring tape with the initials Emma engraved on it. I only knew one person with those initials. Marcus Alves, my patrol partner, went missing on a mission. His body was never found. That night, I couldn't sleep. The sound of the radio turning on by itself came back. This time, it played an old song, one of those used in military emergency broadcasts. I got chills. That same song played the day we lost Marcus. But how? How can anyone know that? I grabbed a flashlight and went to the barn. I had to check if everything was in place. When I opened the door, I smelled it again, that sweet, rotten, sickening scent. And there, among the feed bags, was a wooden box identical to the one I used years ago to store my wife's letters. When I opened it, there was no letter. There was a mirror. It was small, oval, framed in bronze. But the reflection didn't show me. It showed my father, younger, covered in dirt, bleeding from his forehead. He looked straight at me and moved his lips, but no sound came out. After 5 seconds, the image disappeared and the glass cracked. I dropped the mirror and walked out of there, feeling like someone or something was trying to tell me something. But the message was still incomplete, and time was running out. Every object, every sound, every detail was a piece of a puzzle only I could put together. That's when I decided to act. I went back to the basement and opened the old ammunition box. Took out 3 cartridges, cleaned each with a white cloth, and marked them with initials J, M, and B. Jackson, Marcus, and Bill, the only ones who survived that siege in '85. I didn't know why I did it. I just felt I had to. Sometimes instinct speaks louder. When I returned to the bedroom, I found a note under the door. "You're late. They've already begun." No signature, no explanation, but something shifted. From that moment on, it wasn't just about defense anymore. I had to strike back. I started with the neighbors, visited them one by one. Most dodged the questions, but I found clues. Old man Geraldo, a retired hunter, told me he'd seen people entering the woods at night near the dry creek. People who weren't from around here, silent, carrying heavy bags and red lanterns. Dona Inez, a prayer woman from way back, said she had a dream about me being surrounded by faceless eyes. I wrote everything down. They were fragments, loose clues, but little by little, they formed a shape. They were preparing something big, and my land was just the beginning. That night, I lit a fire in the center of the field. An old indigenous custom I learned from a friend up north. Fire in the middle of the land is a sign of respect, a way to say, I'm here, and I'm not leaving. As the flames danced, I heard the whistle again, but this time it came from inside the house. I ran back with my heart pounding. The whistle was coming from the living room. Of that, I was certain. It was soft, almost melodic, but something was wrong, like a note slightly out of tune that makes your body shiver. I entered with my weapon drawn, sweeping the room with the flashlight. Nothing. The radio was off, the TV unplugged, the fireplace still warm from the embers of the night before. And then I saw it, a footprint on the Persian rug, dirty, muddy, with a strange shape as if the heel was twisted inward. That wasn't human, at least not entirely, and it had been inside my home. I followed the prints down the hallway. They led to the room that used to be my daughter's. I'd locked that door 26 years ago, the day she died. I never opened it again, never had the courage, but now it was open. I pushed it slowly, the creak of the wood sending chills down my spine. The room was untouched. The patchwork quilt made by my wife, the wooden rocking horse, the children's books on the shelf, all just as it was. But on the bed, there was a doll, not my daughter's. I'd never seen that doll before. And there was something else. Her eyes were covered with strips of white cloth, and her mouth sewn shut with red thread. Whoever had done that was sending a message. I carefully picked up the doll, wrapped it in cloth, and stored it in the basement chest. Not out of superstition, instinct. That thing couldn't be left out. That same night, the nightmares began. I dreamed I was buried alive, and old voices, voices of dead soldiers, whisper my name. When I woke up, the pillow was soaked in sweat, and the clock frozen again. 4:04. Always 4:04. I grabbed a notebook and started writing compulsively, as if my hand was moving on its own. I drew symbols I didn't recognize, words and languages I'd never studied. I only stopped when the sun rose, weak, shy, as if afraid to shine on whatever I had awakened. At breakfast, I couldn't eat. The bread was stale, the milk sour, even though it was fresh. It was like the house was rotting from the inside. And it wasn't just a metaphor. Dark spots appeared on the ceiling, mold growing from nowhere. The plants wilted within hours. And the cattle, they were restless. 2 calves died in the same night. No wounds, no explanation. Their eyes wide open, as if they'd seen something the mind couldn't comprehend. I called the vet. He never showed. Days later, I heard he'd had a strange accident on the road. A simple curve on a clear day. The car flipped for no reason. The report read, unexplained loss of control. Things were piling up. It was as if an invisible force was testing me, pushing little by little, pressing the edges of my sanity. But what they didn't know was that I'd already lived through hell and survived. I started writing letters, not to send, just to organize my thoughts. I wrote to my wife, to my daughter, to my old war companions, confessions, vows, promises. It was as if each sentence brought a part of me back, until one night, while storing one of the letters, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. The fireplace, which I had left cold, was lit, and inside the flames, a shadow, not an object, a silhouette, as if someone was sitting inside the fire, still watching me. I blinked. It vanished. I walked up, touched the edge, cold. No heat, no burned wood. Impossible, but real. I know what I saw. And next to the fireplace was a new note, childlike handwriting, written with crayon. You promised to protect me. No name, no explanation. Whatever I tried to bury decades ago was coming back, and it had come to collect. The paranoia grew. Every step through the house, I felt eyes watching me, mirrors warping my reflection, rooms changing temperature. The wall clock now chimed 3 times, always at 4:04, until I received another envelope. This time with a single object, an old key, bronze, with a skull carved into the top. I didn't recognize the lock it belonged to, but one thing was clear. That key belonged to something buried in my past. Maybe a safe, maybe a box, maybe a broken promise. Then the phone rang. The first clear voice I'd heard since it all began. A woman, soft voice. Calm. Bill, it's time to pay the debt. You know which one. I asked who she was, but the line went dead. When I tried calling back, I heard only the lullaby I used to sing to my daughter before bed. On loop, once, twice, 3 times. I hung up. My hands were trembling, my stomach twisted, but my chest burned with an old fury. I could have run, could have given in, but in that moment I understood. If they wanted to break me, they'd have to dig much deeper. Much deeper. That night, I buried the doll at the foot of the old oak tree, beside the wooden cross my father made. I said a prayer, not for me, for them. Whoever was pulling these strings had no idea who they were dealing with. And as I shoveled the last bit of dirt, I felt the presence again. Close. Behind me, but I didn't turn around. I didn't need to, because for the first time in weeks, I smiled. I waited for them to leave, in silence. When the door slammed shut, I stood up slowly, took a deep breath, and walked the portrait. Behind it, marked in dry blood, were the words, "She knew. You should have known too." And beneath that, 3 dates. The first, my daughter's birthday. The second, the day of the fire. And the third, tomorrow. I stared at those dates for hours, as if the answer was hidden in the numbers. The third date was tomorrow. That gave me less than 24 hours to figure out what was about to happen. The problem was, I didn't even know what was being announced. Death? Eviction? A revelation I wasn't ready to face? Whatever it was, the clock was ticking. I went back to the basement, grabbed the letters, the maps, the keys, the journal. Each item was a fragment of the puzzle, and the final piece was coming fast. I could feel in the air. The land had changed. The leaves on the old tree had darkened. The wind blew northward. Time was trying to warn me, in its own way. I started going over the details of the fire that destroyed part of the property years ago. They said it was accidental, but I always thought something was off. How it started from the inside out, consuming my daughter's room first. And now, seeing that date marked, the day of the fire, I knew it wasn't a coincidence. The second date was a key. I pulled the records of the incident, dug through old newspapers and the papers I'd kept out of stubbornness. And there it was. 2 days before the fire, a man from Johnson Developments had made an offer for the land. I refused. 2 days later, I lost my daughter. My blood ran cold. I didn't want to believe it, but this was no longer about belief. It was reality, screaming in my face. My daughter didn't die by accident. And maybe I had buried the truth along with her. I went upstairs to the same room where I'd found the doll, sat on the bed, and let the weight fall on me. I didn't cry. I cried everything I had years ago. Now, only anger remained, and a burning desire to uncover who was behind it all. I thought again about the woman's call. You know which debt. Yes, I knew. A promise I made to a dying man, long ago, in a forgotten trench. His name was Bruno, my best friend in the platoon. He saved me when we were ambushed, died in my arms after making me swear to protect his sister, a woman named Clara. Yes, the same Clara who served me coffee for years, who lived 2 plots over. The same Clara who said the land had eyes. It all made sense. Clara knew. She always had. I went to her house, knocked hard, no answer. Tried the doorknob. Locked. I circled around and entered through the back. The house was empty. Warm. Like someone had just left in a hurry. In the center of the living room, a suitcase lay open. Clothes scattered. Half-burned photos. And a handwritten note. It's no longer safe, Bill. They know I told you. I dug through the suitcase. Among the clothes, an envelope with old documents. Certificates, records, sale contracts, and a letter, addressed to me, but never sent. In it, Claire explained that my wife had discovered things about the Johnson Company. things linking its directors to ancient cults, rituals of spiritual land cleansing. She suspected the fire was a sacrifice, and my daughter part of the price. I collapsed to my knees. Everything spun, the house, the walls, the entire world. And then I understood they didn't just want to build. They wanted to erase. Erase stories, memories, roots. They wanted to reset the land. And my property was the last obstacle. I grabbed the documents and ran home. Spent the night reading, organizing, cross-referencing. It all matched. The names of the directors were linked to tragedies in other towns. Always fires. Always children dead. Always after land was refused. The third date, tomorrow, was the next victim. But now, I was ready. I took everything. To the shelter beneath the barn. Organized the space. Loaded the gun. Installed a camera. I wasn't going to run. I was going to wait. I made a circle of salt around the hatch. I'm not superstitious, but at that point, I welcomed any protection. When night fell, I sat down below with a photo of my daughter in hand. I asked forgiveness for not seeing it sooner, for not protecting her as I should have. And I promised, word for word, no one else would die for this land. Not even me. At 4:04, I heard the footsteps again, this time heavier, faster, 3, 4, 5 pairs of boots, muffled voices, and then silence. I waited, held my breath, and the latch began to shake. Someone knew I was down there. Someone was trying to get in. The latch groaned with force. Each creak carried a silent scream. I kept my breath steady, eyes fixed on the steel door. The old trapdoor trembled like someone was throwing their full weight against it. But what alarmed me most wasn't the noise. It was the silence between the sounds. Those seconds when everything stopped, like whoever was on the other side knew exactly what they were doing. I gripped the Colt tightly, cocked it with sharp motion, and braced myself. But suddenly it stopped. The noise ceased. No sound. Nothing but my own ragged breathing and the ticking of my wristwatch. I waited. Minutes felt like hours. When I finally mustered the courage, I slowly climbed the wooden stairs, pushed the hatch open with the barrel of the gun, and looked up. The house lights were on. The radio played. The song? The same lullaby. Always the same. I took short, measured steps. The air smelled of melted wax, damp soil, and lavender. My wife's perfume. The pain hit like a blade, but I couldn't afford distraction. I entered the living room. The frames were fallen. The chairs overturned. They had been inside. They didn't force their way in. They used a key. The same bronze key I had kept my whole life in my coat pocket. And now it was gone. At the center of the table was a new note, written in charcoal, crooked letters. The last seed has been planted. It felt like a code. I went to the shed where I kept the gardening tools. I dug to the fertilizer bags, seed jars, shovels, all normal. But at the back of the wooden drawer, something caught my eye. A handful of fresh, damp soil with no reason to be there. And mixed in, teeth, small, human, childlike. My stomach churned, but I swallowed hard. The pieces were falling into place. Yes, they were leaving clues. But they were also testing my limits. They wanted to break me. They wanted me to lose control. And maybe I would have, if not for the letter I found next. Among the papers scattered across the living room floor, a yellow envelope with my name in trembling but familiar handwriting. Inside, a single folded sheet and one sentence. The root is where the flower died. Sign, Clara. She was alive and trying to help. The flower could only mean my daughter. I went to the old garden in the back, where my wife had once planted white daisies. Our little girl's favorite. I dug with my bare hands, ignoring the pain in my fingers. And there, beneath the dark soil, I found a small metal box. Locked. The bronze key fit perfectly. Inside the box, old documents, photos, records from Johnson Developments. But there was more, a handwritten journal. My wife's, dated weeks before the fire. She wrote that she was being followed, that the company offered money, then threats, that someone had entered the house, that she felt presences. The final entry read, If something happens, protect the land. They want to erase the truth. Her words echoed inside me. She knew. She died trying to protect me. And now, it was my turn to protect her memory. That night, I prepared the house. Set traps. Cut the power. Closed the curtains. I buried her journal in a place only I knew, behind the oldest tree on the farm, and marked the area with white stones, the same symbol we use in war, to signal a safe shelter. When I returned, I noticed someone had touched the family portrait. The photo was gone. In its place, a small oval mirror, just like the one that had appeared days ago. But now, it reflected something worse. A metal table, red stains, chains, and in the background, my daughter, or something that looked like her, faceless, only the eyes glowing like coals. I threw the mirror against the wall. It didn't break, just landed on the floor and stopped reflecting. I took a deep breath, wrote everything down in my journal, every detail. I knew what was coming, and I wasn't going to run. At 4:04, as always, the sound came, but this time it was different. Not a whistle, a cry, a muffled, childlike sob coming from the direction of the barn. I grabbed the flashlight, the gun, and headed out. Along the way, the branches moved without wind. The leaves whispered to each other, and the ground it pulsed, like it was breathing. When I opened the barn door, I saw it. In the center, surrounded by symbols drawn in lime powder, was the doll, the same one, untouched, but now holding an envelope. I picked it up carefully. Inside, one sentence, "You can still choose." On the back, a date, today, and a time, 6:43. 2 minutes left, and I still didn't know what the choice was. 6:43. The watch beeped, and in that instant, everything stopped. The wind, the crickets, even my thoughts froze. It felt like time itself was holding its breath. I stood there in front of the doll, holding the envelope, trying to understand what choose meant. But it wasn't just any choice. I could feel that. It was a fork in a road that could change everything. My life, the land, the truth, to keep the past buried, or dig up secrets even I might not survive. But if my daughter was the price of silence, I had made my choice a long time ago. I just hadn't realized it yet. That's when I heard the footsteps at the barn door. Not running, not hidden, slow, firm, deliberate. I stepped outside, coat in hand, and came face to face with him. Tall, black coat, wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow over his eyes. Skin pale like cracked clay. When he spoke, his voice was coarse, like dry leaves dragging across the ground. "You're late, Bill." I froze. How did he know my name? "You saw too much, dug too deep, and now you must decide whether to water what you've uncovered or bury for good." I stepped closer, demanding to know who he was. He smiled, a crooked, unnatural grin. Just the gardener of this land. I only prune what grows crooked. Before I could react, he dropped a folder at my feet, turned, and disappeared into the shadows as if he'd always belonged to the night. I opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside, documents stamped with the Johnson Development's logo, underground maps of my property, and photographs. Photographs that shattered me. Hidden cameras inside my house. Images of my daughter, still alive, trapped in some kind of medical facility. The timestamps matched. The records were dated before the fire. My daughter hadn't died. She'd been taken. And all this time, I'd been trapped in an illusion built on grief and pain. My stomach turned. I screamed, cried, but there was no time for that. I had to act. At the center of the table was a new note, written in charcoal, crooked letters. "The last seed has been planted." It felt like a code. I went to the shed where I kept the gardening tools. I dug to the fertilizer bags, seed jars, shovels. All normal. But at the back of the wooden drawer, something caught my eye. A handful of fresh, damp soil, with no reason to be there, and mixed in teeth, small, human, childlike. My stomach churned, but I swallowed hard. The pieces were falling into place. Yes, they were leaving clues, but they were also testing my limits. They wanted to break me, They wanted me to lose control. And maybe I would have, if not for the letter I found next. Among the papers scattered across the living room floor, a yellow envelope with my name in trembling but familiar handwriting. Inside, a single folded sheet and one sentence. The root is where the flower died. Signed, Clara. She was alive and trying to help. The flower could only mean my daughter. I went to the old garden in the back, where my wife had once planted white daisies, our little girl's favorite. I dug with my bare hands, ignoring the pain in my fingers. And there, beneath the dark soil, I found a small metal box. Locked, the bronze key fit perfectly. Inside the box, old documents, photos, records from Johnson Developments. But there was more, a handwritten journal. My wife's, dated weeks before the fire. She wrote that she was being followed, that the company offered money, then threats, that someone had entered the house, that she felt presences. The final entry read, "If something happens, protect the land." They want to erase the truth. Her words echoed inside me. She knew. She died trying to protect me. And now, it was my turn to protect her memory. That night, I prepared the house, set traps, cut the power, closed the curtains. I buried her journal in a place only I knew, behind the oldest tree on the farm, and marked the area with white stones, the same symbol we use in war to signal a safe shelter. When I returned, I noticed someone had touched the family portrait. The photo was gone. In its place, a small oval mirror, just like the one that had appeared days ago. But now, it reflected something worse. A metal table, red stains, chains, and in the background, my daughter, or something that looked like her, faceless, only the eyes glowing like coals. I threw the mirror against the wall. It didn't break, just landed on the floor and stopped reflecting. I took a deep breath, wrote everything down in my journal, every detail. I knew what was coming, and I wasn't going to run. At 4:04, as always, the sound came, but this time it was different. Not a whistle, a cry, a muffled, childlike sob coming from the direction of the barn. I grabbed the flashlight, the gun, and headed out. Along the way, the branches moved without wind. The leaves whispered to each other, and the ground it pulsed like it was breathing. When I opened the barn door, I saw it. In the center, surrounded by symbols drawn in lime powder, was a doll, the same one, untouched, but now holding an envelope. I picked it up carefully. Inside, one sentence, "You can still choose." On the back, a date, today, and a time, 6:43. 2 minutes left, and I still didn't know what the choice was. 6:43. The watch beeped, and in that instant, everything stopped. The wind, the crickets, even my thoughts froze. It felt like time itself was holding its breath. I stood there, in front of the doll, holding the envelope, trying to understand what choose meant. But it wasn't just any choice. I could feel that. It was a fork in the road that could change everything. My life, the land, the truth, to keep the past buried, or dig up secrets even I might not survive. But if my daughter was the price of silence, I had made my choice a long time ago. I just hadn't realized it yet. That's when I heard the footsteps at the barn door. Not running, not hidden, slow, firm, deliberate. I stepped outside, coat in hand, and came face to face with him. Tall, black coat, wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow over his eyes. Skin pale like cracked clay. When he spoke, his voice was coarse, like dry leaves dragging across the ground. "You're late, Bill." I froze. How did he know my name? "You saw too much, dug too deep, and now you must decide whether to water what you've uncovered or bury it for good." I stepped closer, demanding to know who he was. He smiled, a crooked, unnatural grin. Just the gardener of this land. I only prune what grows crooked. Before I could react, he dropped a folder at my feet, turned, and disappeared into the shadows as if he'd always belonged to the night. I opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside, documents stamped with the Johnson Development's logo, underground maps of my property, and photographs. Photographs that shattered me. Hidden cameras inside my house. Images of my daughter, still alive, trapped in some kind of medical facility. The timestamps matched. The records were dated before the fire. My daughter hadn't died. She'd been taken. And all this time, I'd been trapped in an illusion built on grief and pain. My stomach turned. I screamed, cried, but there was no time for that. I had to act. Part final logo abexo, ultimo trecho con desfecho, y epilogo a seguir. Ja continuo. Acquiesto ultimo trecho de tragiceo, o inserimento completo. Durotero loyalty still means something in this country. A jornada de Bill Anderson. 8 OFIM. I took everything to the basement, spread the documents across the table, try and make sense of the patterns. I discovered there was an underground gallery beneath my farm, not just a shelter, but a tunnel system connecting parts of the town now owned by the company. There were records of nighttime movements, missing children, rituals held in the 80s. The debt they kept mentioning was silence. It was about something I saw years ago, something I wasn't supposed to witness. One of the tunnels, according to the maps, led beneath the old dried-up well behind the shed. And if my daughter was still alive, or if anything of her remained, that's where I needed to go. I grabbed the flashlight, the gun, and descended with a heart pounding out of rhythm. The well's mouth was hidden beneath fallen leaves, like the earth itself was trying to cover the scar. I cleared the debris and crouched. A cracked concrete tunnel opened below. Narrow, damp, the air reeked of rust and rotting flesh. The walls were covered in child-sized handprints. Some looked fresh. The ground sank beneath my steps, and the silence was so thick I could hear my heart beat like war drums. After several meters, the tunnel widened, forming a hallway with rusted metal doors on both sides. I opened the first, empty. The second, empty. The third, dry blood on the walls. And a name, finger-written, Annie, my daughter. I stepped inside. The room was small with a bed, a broken lamp, and dozens of children's drawings on the walls. Houses, trees, faces, and always the dark figure lurking in the corner of each sketch. I stumbled out. The air felt heavier now. Up ahead, a staircase led to a steel door with a symbol I already knew. The cross spiral. The same one from the tree, from the shed. This was it. I climbed the steps, pushed open the door. It creaked slowly, almost theatrically. And there, in the center of a room lit by yellow bulbs and extinguished candles, was a chair. And in it, a woman. Long, filthy hair, pale skin, wrists tied. As I got closer, she lifted her eyes, and in them, I saw something I'd never seen before, recognition. She called me Dad. I collapsed to my knees. It was her, my girl, but not the same. Time had marked her with invisible scars. She didn't cry, just looked at me like someone begging for permission to exist. I untied the ropes with trembling hands, and that's when I heard it, applause echoing from the darkness, slow, mocking, like the walls themselves were laughing at me. I spun around, coat raised, flashlight flickering. Sweat rolled down my spine. And then he emerged, the man in the coat, the same pale face, sunken eyes, that twisted smile. Congratulations, Bill. You found your flower. But she doesn't grow anymore. Every word stabbed like a needle beneath my skin. My daughter, beside me, lowered her head, as if she'd heard those words before, as if she believed them. But I didn't. I refused. She stayed here by choice, he said. We raised her, fed her with the fear and silence you left behind. I shouted it was a lie, that she was a victim. He laughed. We all are at first, but then we choose. I stepped closer, ready to fire. He didn't flinch, just pointed the wall behind him, an enormous, dusty mirror. Look, Bill, see for yourself. Against my will, my eyes turned, and there I saw myself, younger, not alone, with her, with my daughter, and handed her over to a man in a lab coat. My body froze. It couldn't be. That wasn't real, but it was my face, my clothes, My watch. I was there. I tried to remember, tried to deny, but there was a hole in my memory. Years ago, when the threats began, there was a day I could never explain. I woke up in the barn, face dirty, hands trembling, with no idea how I got there. My wife said I was acting strange, said I spoke to someone at night. I thought it was the stress of war, but maybe they broke me, used me, maybe they wiped my mind. Or worse, maybe I agreed. He stepped closer. I could smell him, burnt earth and formaldehyde. You paid the debt, Bill. You just didn't know you were paying it. I fell to my knees, not from physical pain, from the collapse within, my daughter, the lost years, the broken memories. But even so, even without the full truth, I looked at her and I knew I was still her father, and I wasn't going to let them take her again. I stood, aimed at the man's chest, and fired. The sound thundered off the walls, but he smiled. The bullet passed through, no effect. He shook his head. You don't kill a gardener with lead. And vanished into smoke. The room fell silent. Just the two of us, me and my daughter. She was still trembling. I reached out, held her hand, and said the only thing that made sense. Let's go home. She hesitated, then stood, and together we walked through the dark tunnels back to the surface. The sun was rising, but not just any dawn. The sky burned orange, like the world knew something had changed. We walked in silence back to the house. She looked around as if seeing it for the first time, and maybe her child had stolen, her home violated, her past twisted, but now she was here, and that in itself was a miracle. We had coffee, sat on the porch for hours, said nothing, just listened to the wind, and in that silence, I realized the war wasn't over, but I wasn't alone anymore. In the following days, I organized the documents, made copies, contacted an old journalist friend, someone who owed me. I sent everything anonymously. The story had come out. The world had to know, but not with my name, not with my land in the headlines. This was bigger than me. It was for everyone who had been silenced, for every child who vanished, for what might still be prevented. The news broke slowly, then exploded. Headlines everywhere. Scandal, investigations, buildings raided, Johnson Development's board gone. And with them, a sense that something ancient had pulled back. For now, my daughter began to speak. Sparingly, fragments, sounds, symbols, voices that didn't age. A figure who watched from afar, but never touched. A guardian, she said. One who planted fear like seeds, waiting for it to grow. And then I understood this was never just about land. It was about control, about legacy, about what we bury thinking it's dead, but that still breathes beneath our feet. Last night, she brought me a drawing. It was the house, but with roots, deep roots stretching for miles. And in the center, a heart, broken, but beating. She smiled, small, but real. And in that moment, I knew, even if they come back, even if the shadows creep again, we are ready. It's been 7 days since my daughter returned home. 7 days of silence, of rebuilding glances, tentative gestures, memories stitching themselves back together. Time moves differently here now, slower, as if the land is watching, measuring every step. The farm breathes again, but not the same way. The wood still creaks. The radio still turns on sometimes. The scent of lavender drifts through the halls at night. But now I know it's not threat. It's memory, presence, the echo of what was lost and what still endures. I don't sleep at night, not out of fear, out of respect. I sit on the porch, listen to the forest. The owl has returned. The horses no longer freeze by the barn. The dogs, they're restless but watchful, as if they sense something ancient has stirred. My daughter sleeps in the guest room, not ready to return to her old one. I don't push. She has her rituals, reads, draws symbols, repeats sketches until the lines feel right. And sometimes she says things that chill me. The man with the hat also dreams. Or they want to plant more flowers. I don't understand it all, but I write it down. Everything. My new journal is already on its third cover, because every detail matters. What she lived is still happening. Somewhere we can't see but can feel. Today, while cleaning the shed, I found a sealed envelope. Black wax. Paper thick and old, like military correspondence. Only my name written on it. Inside, one sentence. Protect the root. They're coming for the tree. I froze, because days ago, I dreamed exactly that. They were digging around the old oak, and from it spilled a thick, dark liquid that crept toward the house. In the dream, I tried to stop them, but the more they dug, the more the tree bled. Now the message. Who left it? How did they know? I went to the oak at dusk. The sky burned orange, same color as the day of the fire. I sat by the tree, where I buried my wife's journal, closed my eyes. I didn't ask for answers. I listened, and in that deep silence, I swear I heard her voice, soft, calm. You did your part, but the land has its own memory. I returned with wet eyes, but a steady heart. This land may carry pain, but it also carries love, and that they cannot erase.